Thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, there's a link at the bottom of the show notes. You can click and send me a text message. When speaking of the American Revolution, I think there's this notion that America, by the time of revolutionary vigor, was a land filled with adventurers and fortune seekers, cowboys almost, those that preceded the cowboys, people that had disdain for authority. But the truth is that a century or more earlier, America had been seeded by two waves of exiles, if you will, from England during their Civil War. The first wave was religious tolerance-seeking Scots that fled to the northern parts of America. Not long after, a second wave of England's aristocracy, some of them at least, fled mainly to the Virginia areas. These two groups of people, wanting a degree of freedom and that did have some disdain for authority, fled and came across the Atlantic, seeding America's population with what would eventually become the revolutionaries of the American War. Let's now experience England's Civil War at the Battle of Naseby.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 32, The Battle of Naseby, the 14th of June, 1645. Monarchic forces, 4,000 cavalry and 3,500 infantry. Parliamentary forces, 6,500 cavalry and 7,000 infantry. The long-standing rivalry between the authority of the king and the rising power of Parliament reached a provisional conclusion, with Parliament emerging victorious. This victory established the foundation of parliamentary democracy in England, a seismic shift that reverberated across the Atlantic, deeply influencing the governance of English colonies, particularly in America.
In the aftermath of the War of the Roses from 1455 to 1485, England's government stood as a fortress of stability, unshaken by the tempests that once tore it apart. The monarch reigned with an iron grip, if not absolute, then certainly unchallenged, with only the faintest shadows of restraint. His treasury brimmed with wealth drawn from the lifeblood of tariffs and the vast yields of royal lands, ensuring his independence from the burden of frequent taxation. Such opulence allowed kings to rule without constantly burning their subjects with taxes, and Parliament, for nearly 2 centuries, remained an afterthought, gathering dust in the shadows of royal power. As long as the monarchs ruled with at least a modicum of foresight and did not squander their wealth, the people remained content, the kingdom peaceful under their banner. For nearly 200 years, this delicate balance held, but in the early 17th century, the insatiable ambitions of the crown began to strain the royal coffers, forcing kings to summon Parliament once more to fill their war chests. As the monarchy's gaze turned outward, with grand schemes on the continent, Parliament stirred. The weight of foreign campaigns pressed heavily upon the treasury, and the once dormant body began to assert its right to a seat at the table of power. With Europe drowning in riches from the Americas, inflation surged like a tide, and the steady income of previous reigns could no longer sustain the crown's ever-mounting costs. The golden days of self-sufficiency were over. For King James I and his son Charles I, fortune soured, as they placed their trust in the ill-fated Duke of Buckingham, whose counsel would soon lead them into the jaws of disaster. From 1624 to 1628, Buckingham's reckless ventures against Spain and Holland crumbled into ruin, each failure deepening the crown's desperation and emptying its coffers. In the aftermath of these catastrophes, first James, then Charles, were left no choice but to summon Parliament, the old enemy, to beg for funds. With each call to session, Parliament grew more defiant, less willing to bend, its hunger for authority sharpening with every demand the crown made. By January 1629, Parliament, now under the steely leadership of John Pym, rose in open defiance, contesting Charles on every front, from the throne's authority to the kingdom's very governance. The struggle escalated as Parliament took aim at Charles's most powerful allies, the ruthless Earl of Strafford and the fanatical Archbishop Laud, igniting a fierce battle in the courts and the economy. Strafford, the iron fist of Charles's rule, had forged a standing army in Ireland, an expensive force that bled the treasury. Meanwhile, Laud's unrelenting drive to enforce strict Anglican rule fanned the flames of rebellion amongst the fiercely Calvinist Scots. With an army to fund and the Scots in open revolt, Parliament seized the moment, wielding financial power like a weapon to gain leverage over the crown. By 1640, Parliament struck decisively, impeaching Laud, and in 1641, forcing Charles to sign the death warrant of his most loyal servant, Strafford. A king's blade turned upon himself. With the king humbled, Parliament unleashed a torrent of new laws, each one chiseling away at the monarchy's authority, building its own power, brick by brick. John Pym, Parliament's firebrand, leveled accusations of treason against the Queen herself, provoking Charles to retaliate with equal ferocity, charging Pym in kind. When Charles failed to seize Pym, and with Parliament tightening its grip on London's political and economic heart, the king fled to Nottingham, raising his standard and calling the realm to his defense against an ever more revolutionary Parliament. Thus began the English Civil War, the inevitable clash born of royal arrogance and parliamentary ambition, a conflict that would tear the nation asunder. King Charles summoned the loyalty of England's aristocracy, drawing strength from the rugged northern counties and the defiant lands of Wales. Meanwhile, southeastern England, with its bustling heart in London, cast its lot with Parliament, splitting the kingdom along bitter lines of loyalty. The king's noble allies mustered a formidable army, bolstered by battle-hardened mercenaries fresh from the brutal campaigns of the 30 Years' War on the continent, men accustomed to slaughter and chaos. Strafford's death had left the realm without a standing army, forcing Charles to rely on the hastily gathered forces of his loyalists and mercenaries, scrambling to match Parliament's rising power. Yet despite his efforts, Charles found himself crippled by Parliament's iron grip on the navy, severing his lines of communication and the flow of vital supplies from the continent, leaving him dangerously isolated. Though Parliament enjoyed deeper coffers, its early efforts floundered under the weight of internal bickering, unable to harness its resources into a unified military front. In the opening acts of the conflict, the Royalists gained a powerful weapon in the form of Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's fiery nephew from Holland, whose audacity on the battlefield earned him swift renown. Despite being a mere 23 years old, Rupert had worn the mantle of a soldier since the tender age of 14, commanding the Cavaliers, the noble warriors of the king, with fiery charisma, though his leadership often struggled to tame their unruly nature. These Cavaliers were raiders at heart, swift and brutal in their assaults. But in the heat of battle, their lack of discipline often unraveled any hope of sustained victory. In opposition rose a man of iron will, Oliver Cromwell. His genius forged the Roundheads' cavalry into a fearsome force, the Ironsides, whose discipline and relentless resolve stood in stark contrast to the reckless charge of Rupert's Cavaliers. From the crucible of war, Rupert and Cromwell emerged as its towering giants, their names soon to be etched in blood and fire across the history of England. By the late summer of 1643, Pym reignited the ancient pact with the Scots, securing their might in exchange for religious autonomy. In one swift move, the power of the Church of England was extinguished north of the border, paving the way for Presbyterian rule in Scotland. Upon hearing of this treacherous alliance, the Marquis of Montrose, one of Charles's few remaining allies in Scotland, rode like the wind to warn the king, offering to rally those still loyal to the crown. Yet Charles, wary of igniting another civil war on Scottish soil, rejected Montrose's offer. It was a fatal hesitation, for by January 1644, Scottish armies marched south, and the king found himself trapped between two advancing enemies. By early July, the Roundheads crushed the Royalists at Marston Moor, seizing the north for Parliament. Charles, battered and bloodied, was forced to retreat south, his grip on the north forever broken. Charles sought refuge in Oxford, his new seat of power, while his forces scraped together minor victories in Cornwall, small flames of hope amid the gathering storm. A fragile truce flickered briefly at year's end, but Charles, defiant as ever, shattered any hope of peace by rejecting Parliament's proposals for a new government. Parliament, hamstrung by endless internal discord, failed to press its advantage, allowing the king to recover strength despite his desperate position. By April 1645, Parliament took a decisive step, stripping all its members, save for Cromwell, of military command, an act that cleared the way for focused leadership in the field. This cleared division of power breathed new life into the Roundheads, allowing them to concentrate on building their own formidable standing army, free from the shackles of political interference. Thus, the new model army was born, its soldiers clad in striking red coats, a symbol of discipline and resolve that would define the British military for centuries to come. Though many of its ranks were filled by reluctant conscripts, Cromwell, alongside Lord Fairfax, forged them into a disciplined machine, drilling into them the cold precision of professional soldiers. By the spring of 1645, the new model army was primed for battle, ready to march on Oxford and bring the king's forces to heel. Charles, beset by infighting among his own commanders, made the fatal error of dividing his forces, sending Prince Rupert north to reclaim York while dispatching Lord George Goring westward, a move that weakened his already fragile war effort. This ill-considered division of his army, already dwarfed by Parliament's strength, proved a critical misstep, one from which the king would never recover. Despite this blunder, Rupert struck fast, storming and seizing Leicester in a bold assault, a blow that sent shockwaves through the Roundhead ranks. Yet the victory was fleeting. News reached Charles of the Roundhead siege on his stronghold in Oxford, and with urgency, he ignored Rupert's protests, commanding his forces to abandon their northern gains and march south. Upon learning of the Royalist advance, Lord Fairfax swiftly lifted his siege, marching his forces north to intercept the Cavaliers before they could strike again. The two armies collided by chance near the quiet town of Naseby, 50 miles north of Oxford, their fates entwined in a clash that neither side had fully anticipated. On the morning of June 14th, Rupert's army stood ready atop a hill north of Naseby. As he rode out to scout the enemy, he spied the Roundheads withdrawing toward the town, a sight that sparked his thirst for blood. Mistaking their redeployment for a retreat, Rupert commanded his army to charge down from their high ground in pursuit, eager to crush what he believed was a fleeing army. But the Roundheads had no intention of retreating. They were methodically repositioning, fortifying their lines on a slope of their own, hidden from Rupert's view. Throughout the morning, both armies maneuvered into place. Charles arranged his forces with meticulous care, 3 imposing lines of infantry at the center, a deadly mix of musketeers and pikemen, while cavalry flanked them, ready to strike from the sides. Though Rupert was the Royalist commander, he abandoned his post on the eve of battle, driven by a bitter argument with Lord Digby, a scheming flatterer whose poisonous words played on Charles's vanity and undermined Rupert's authority. Rupert, in a fateful move, withdrew from the heart of the battlefield, assuming command of the right wing, a decision that would shatter any hope of cohesive leadership when the chaos of battle descended. Opposite them, Fairfax deployed his Roundhead forces in a near-mirror image upon Mill Hill. His army, outnumbering the Cavaliers nearly 2-1, 13,500 to 7,500, was carefully arranged. The least disciplined stood in the vanguard, while seasoned veterans and officers waited behind, ready to reinforce or restore order. This formation served a dual purpose: to stiffen the resolve of the Green troops and to ensure a steady, unshakable second line should the front falter. Cromwell's infamous Ironsides, a cavalry force renowned for their brutal efficiency, took their place on the right flank, while the left was held by another cavalry contingent under the command of Henry Ireton. To the west, a thick, sprawling hedgerow marked the edge of the battlefield. Behind it, Fairfax concealed 1,000 dragoons, ready to strike from the shadows at a moment's notice. At 10 a.m., the still air shattered as Royalist cannons roared to life, launching a barrage of fire. The Cavalry infantry began their advance, but the long, untamed grass beneath their feet hindered their progress, breaking their once straight ranks into disarray. Ireton's cavalry surged forward from the Roundhead left, driving towards Rupert's position, while the Roundhead infantry, disciplined and patient, waited in silence on the far side of Mill Hill, holding their fire until the Cavalier infantry had drawn close enough to feel their wrath. At the critical moment, the Roundhead infantry surged forward, rising from their concealment to confront the advancing Royalists head-on. Rupert, ever the aggressor, spurred his cavalry into a furious charge, abandoning the musketeers tasked with supporting them as he sought to smash through Ireton's forces. Rupert's cavalry slammed into Ireton's men, the clash of steel ringing out across the field. But after a fierce melee, the first wave of cavaliers broke off and withdrew, seemingly spent. Believing his enemy routed, Ireton wheeled his cavalry away from Rupert's men, setting his sights on the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry. But Rupert was not finished. He unleashed his second wave of cavalry, crashing into Ireton's now vulnerable flank with devastating force, sending the Roundhead cavalry fleeing from the battlefield in disarray. Meanwhile, the Royalist infantry drove hard against the new model army's front rank, steadily forcing them back with relentless pressure. Undeterred by Ireton's failed attempt to outflank them, the Royalist infantry pressed forward, their advance causing the front ranks of the Roundhead infantry to fall back under the weight of their assault. But Fairfax's foresight bore fruit. His veteran troops, stationed in the second line, surged forward at his command, meeting the Royalist onslaught and halting their momentum with unyielding resolve. Rupert, at this moment, should have mirrored Ireton's earlier strategy and struck the enemy flank, but the undisciplined nature of his Cavalier cavalry revealed itself. Instead of seizing the chance, they broke away, hunting down Ireton's fleeing men and raiding the baggage camp in a lust for plunder. Though a fierce defense of the camp thwarted their looting spree, Rupert's failure to maintain control over his men sealed the fate of the battle, dooming the Royalist cause in that moment of recklessness. On the Roundhead right, Cromwell's Ironsides collided with Sir Marmaduke Langdale's cavalry. The clash violent and unforgiving. In the heat of battle, Cromwell's disciplined ranks withstood the storm, and Langdale's cavalry, battered and broken, was forced to withdraw. Ever the strategist, Cromwell ordered his front rank to hold firm. Pinning the Royalists in place, with his second line, he launched a devastating strike into the exposed flank and rear of the Royalist infantry, tearing through their ranks with ruthless precision. King Charles, watching the battle unravel, saw the opportunity to rally his reserves and salvage the day. He was on the brink of leading them into the fray himself, ready to risk it all, when a hesitant advisor stepped in, fearfully cautioning, quote, "Will you ride to your death?" End quote. In that fatal moment of hesitation, the chance slipped away. Charles faltered, the fire of resolve dimming in his eyes. His reserves, robbed of their momentum, stood idle in disarray, watching helplessly as Cromwell's forces closed in, encircling the embattled Royalist infantry. Fairfax, sensing victory within reach, unleashed a final, crushing charge with his third rank. His men slammed into the Royalist infantry, pinning them from the front, while Cromwell's cavalry hammered them relentlessly from the east, sealing their doom in an unforgiving pincer. Not even Rupert's dramatic return to the battlefield could reignite the courage of the shattered Royalist ranks. Despairing, King Charles abandoned his cause, and he fled, leaving the battlefield and his crown to the advancing Roundheads. By midday, the battlefield lay silent. Charles's army had been annihilated. 1,000 lay dead, 5,000 were taken prisoner, and every piece of artillery and baggage had fallen into Roundhead hands. The king's might had crumbled into dust. As the new model army obliterated the last remnants of royalist infantry and turned their sights on the King's Reserve cavalry, the Cavaliers were gripped by fear. The sheer discipline and ferocity of Cromwell's men broke their spirits, sending them fleeing in terror. The Ironsides gave chase for 14 relentless miles, hunting them nearly to the gates of Leicester. The Roundheads emerged nearly unscathed. With fewer than 1,000 casualties, their victory total and overwhelming. Charles fled to Wales, desperate to muster another army, but his efforts were in vain. His power had crumbled beyond repair. With momentum firmly on their side, the new model army surged forward. Over the following months, they systematically crushed royalist strongholds across the kingdom, tightening their grip on a broken and a defeated land. When Harlech Castle, the last royalist bastion, surrendered in March of 1647, Charles had already spent 2 months as a prisoner of Parliament, his fate now in the hands of his enemies. The people still clung to the belief that the kingdom needed a monarch to govern, and so Parliament, though triumphant, spared Charles's life, seeking to reduce him to little more than a puppet on their strings. But Charles, ever defiant, continued his secret plotting, igniting a second civil war in 1649. Parliament's patience had reached its end. In January of that year, Parliament made the fateful decision. The executioner's blade fell, and King Charles was no more, marking the death of the monarchy as it had once been known. Yet Charles's death did not secure Parliament's rule. The new model army, having tasted power, had grown deeply politicized, becoming the true authority in England, eclipsing even Parliament's control. When Parliament faltered in its attempts to govern, Cromwell, with the army at his back, struck ruthlessly. In 1653, he dissolved Parliament, taking the reins of power as Lord Protector, the undisputed ruler of England. And for the next 5 years, Cromwell ruled as a dictator in all but name, wielding absolute authority over the nation until his death in 1658. After Cromwell's death, a fierce power struggle erupted, and it was George Monk, the army's new commander, who emerged victorious, seizing control amidst the chaos. In 1660, under Monk's command, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II ascended to the throne, the crown returning to the Stuarts. Though forever changed by the fires of war, Cromwell's triumph at Naseby and the brutal reign that followed simultaneously affirmed and shattered the notion of kingship. His rise demonstrated that England could endure without a king, but also underscored the need for strong leadership to prevent chaos. A parliament unrestrained by limits had spiraled out of control, and it was Cromwell who checked their power, disbanding the assembly to assert that only a strong executive could govern England's turbulent realm. Yet the fact that Parliament's forces had toppled an unpopular monarch proved the necessity of a governing body more attuned to the people's desires, a balance between authority and accountability. Cromwell's refusal to accept the crown himself sent a powerful message. A monarchy, though traditional, was not the sole answer to England's needs for leadership. The Battle of Naseby and Cromwell's rise marked the beginning of the end for unchecked royal authority, forever limiting the power future kings could wield. A final battle near Dunkirk in 1660 would seal Parliament's supremacy in the English system of government, ensuring the crown would never again reign unchecked. Across the Atlantic, the ripples of England's internal strife reached America, bringing unexpected benefits from the struggle between Parliament and the crown. When Archbishop Laud, Charles I's loyal enforcer, unleashed persecution upon the Northern Church in the late 1630s, scores of Scots fled to the shores of North America, swelling the populations of the northern colonies. During Cromwell's reign, another wave of exiles swept across the Atlantic, this time from the upper classes, enriching the central colonies, Virginia most notably, with new settlers. Thus, America's growing population, shaped by the bitter lessons of English conflict, harbored deep resentment toward both king and parliament. These seeds of defiance would one day bloom into the American Revolution, a struggle that, like the English Civil War, would strike a fatal blow to the notion of absolute monarchy worldwide.